lack of pixels in an image is what constitutes a transparency. So when I'm referring to one, I'll just show you briefly what I mean. I'm just going to go to File, New, and New Image. And I'm actually going to create a brand new image. It doesn't really matter the size of this image. This is just for some comprehension here. But basically, I'll make a new file. Let's just call it transparency. And then it'll just be 3000 by 3000 pixels at 300 dpi. And the background contents, importantly, will be transparent. So it's going to create this for me and it's going to open it up. So this is a custom file. Basically, this contains no visual information whatsoever. So this checkerboard pattern you see here is ACDSee's way of visualizing a transparency. So what a transparency is it is a lack of pixels. It's interesting to note that so when we're looking at pixels in an image, basically pixels are going to be a degree of color, right? A hue in this case. They're going to be a degree of saturation, and they're going to be a degree of brightness. And a way to think about this and understand this is to click on the foreground color picker just up at the top here. And if we just click on the custom pane, it's actually a really easy way of understanding this. So hue is determined by this slider right here, basically. Hue just refers to essentially a true color or a color at its utmost brightness and its utmost saturation. And then brightness and saturation are sort of interpreted here on this horizontal or vertical slider, with brightness being the vertical component here and saturation being the horizontal component. An image that has low saturation will be gray. An image that has low brightness will be black. You know, an image that has high brightness will be closer to white. An image that has a high saturation will have higher saturation or be closer to the true hue of a color. And then obviously the hue determines what, you know, version of the spectrum you're seeing in terms of, you know, its color or its light. So when you place an image on here, let's do that. I'm just going to click on the add a file as a layer. We'll find an image to put in here. It really doesn't matter what image we're putting in here, but let's just go to the folder we have set up for this workshop, and we'll place this subject here. So we have our subject here. And so one way to understand this relationship that we have here is if we navigate to the eyedropper. The eyedropper at any given pixel in this image, you can see those values change, right? And so if we think of this image, we can think of it really as a series of like extremely small squares. And in those extremely small squares, those pixels, there is some value being placed there, some value sort of inputted there. And so when we hover over our image here and the colors associated with our image, those values change. And so if we're looking at our color picker here, this particular pixel refers to an image that has the following corresponding hue, brightness, and saturation levels. Interpreted this way as RGB K, I guess, in this case. So R just being red with a value of 94, green being a value of 92, blue being a value of 53, and its brightness, or in this case, brightness value being 88. So what this tells me is a value that is closest, or a value that is its lowest component or lowest value would be 0, and then its highest value would be 255. So 94, somewhat lower to the middle in that relationship. And what that means is this image has, not only does it have relatively low brightness, meaning it's maybe closer to an image that's a darker color, but it's also lower values in terms of its saturation. So those saturation values are in the 90s. They're not near 255, which would mean that the color would be really bright and closer to a true hue. And in the case of the blue, that value is the lowest. So that means that there's more red and more green present in this pixel than there is blue, for example, which scans because it's kind of like an olive color. So all I'm trying to say here is that when we're talking about transparencies, what we're talking about is an omission of these qualities from your image, an omission of color as determined by a little tiny pixel that has those values in your image. So let's talk about an actual transparency now and what that means. I'm just going to navigate away from this image. We'll come back to it later if we need to. So let's go back into our this woman here just on her own, and we'll talk a bit about this image. LJ, I did see your post, by the way. I'll write it down in a moment here. At a natural pause. So I have my image of this woman here. And right now, as you can see, much like we just described, the image is displayed in full. So 100% of the pixels in this image have a pixel associated with essentially all of the pixels have values. So when we're talking about transparencies, what we're talking about is an image that, at least when I'm talking about transparencies, I'm talking about an image where we select something in the image and then we omit a large portion of our image. And a way to think about that is, okay, well, I want to select the subject of a particular image, and then I want to remove the rest. And so what that might look like is in the case of profile photos or in the case of fashion photography, it might look like capturing the subject of our image, the person in our image, and removing the background from our image. And so when we go to save that image, we can save it as a transparency rather than a flattened image that would just produce white as a value in the space of the parts of our image that, ideally were transparent. So in ACDSee, I have my subject here. There's a couple ways we can do this. Right off the bat, probably the easiest to understand would be the AI actions function, and we'll probably be a little bit reliant on these just because they're so fast. In past versions of ACDSee, selections were not automated. We didn't have these AI selection processes. So what selections were created manually. Manual selections you can find up at this top corner right here. If you can see this section right here. Manual selections meant that I would be determining, in this case, what part of my image I wanted to create a selection of, and what part of my image I wanted to, not select in this case. So if I was using something like the brush selection tool, for example, I would, make a selection. The selection in this case is indicated by this red overlay that I'm seeing. All this red overlay tells me is it's saying, hey, Adam, you've made a selection. Now what do you want to do with it? And so that red is just a holding area, a place where it's telling me that this part of the image is currently of interest to you. Inversely, the part of our image that doesn't contain this red is not of interest to you. So selections are a method by which we go about the process of masking our image, which is how we create transparencies, which we'll come back to as well. But my point is that all of these tools prior to AI actions were manual, meaning that I had to actually interact with them really directly. I had to make those choices and predominantly use my nib, my mouse cursor here, to actually make the selections themselves. So we had the brush selection tool. We have the shape selection tool, the rectangle, the elliptical tool, the lasso, which most people will be very familiar with. It's kind of like a classic photo editing selection method. Then we have something called the magic wand. And then recently, we've also added, with our AI actions, also an AI object selection tool, which once again focuses in on sort of a subject matter of your image predicated upon your selection. So what something like this might look like, and we'll see whether or not this does a good job of selecting our woman in this image here, but I would basically navigate around my subject here, and then it will make a selection for me, and it did a pretty good job. Actually, it did about as good of a job as the select subject is going to do. So this red area is now a selection that's telling me, hey, you've made a selection. You've chosen what parts of your image you want to do something with. Now, actually, what do you want to do? And there's several things you can do. For the most part, we explore using adjustment layers. So this little box underneath the layer panel, these contain all sorts of different adjustments that you can apply to the area that you've selected. For example, I can increase the vibrance of my subject. I can increase or I could adjust the curves in this case. I could adjust the sharpness or clarity, or I could make it a negative or black and white, etc. But we're less interested in adjustments at this point, and we're more interested in how do we create transparency. So if I was using a manual method like the brush tool, or I was using maybe AI object selection or something like that, I could then create a transparency by establishing my selection and then going to the add a layer mask and masking predicated on that selection. I'm just going to go to select and deselect to remove that active selection. So let's come back to what we were talking about earlier. So what I have here now is I have my subject, which I've selected based on, in this case, AI object selection. So I've said, hey, this is my subject area. This is my area of interest. I'm going to make a marquee selection around my area of interest. And then I'm going to mask accordingly. Now, I cover masks in a lot of different workshops. We'll cover them briefly here. It's not essential information in the same way it is with other workshops, but it is important. Masks are a way of removing pixel information from parts of your image that you didn't select. So in this case, what I have here is I have my subject. You can see that. You can see that there are still pixels associated with this woman. But what you should obviously see now is that there's this checkerboard pattern that appears around my subject. This checkerboard pattern tells me really valuable information about my image. If you can recall to me opening up my brand new image, there was no pixel information in that image. It was just all checkerboard. That tells me that these pixels don't contain any pixel information, as I described with the sort of using the color picker to just sort of show how each one of those can be these tiny, tiny, tiny little squares. More than this, though, this also tells me that if I was to save this image in a format that can support transparencies, star on that, support transparencies, that this image, if I was to save it as is, would be supported, and that would be treated as a transparent part of my image. We'll get to this. So what we should also take away from this is that this particular selection matches the mask that I can see right here. When I say masking or mask, I'm referring to a relationship that's right here. This little box here is what we're going to call a mask thumbnail. And this mask thumbnail tells me that the white part of the thumbnail, this little part here, is being presented to us in full and contains pixel information. The black part of the mask thumbnail tells me that those pixels are hidden from view. And in this case, we can think of hidden from view as containing no pixel information, and therefore transparent. Those pixels still very much exist. I haven't erased them. Working with masks is non-destructive. It's not equivalent to me taking a brush tool or an eraser tool and going around and erasing these components. No, it's not. That would be a destructive change. It would be essentially removing from the original in a way that masking isn't. How do I display this? So next to the mask, you can see my original image or my base image, and the mask is informing the base image. It's so if I was to take this mask here, and if I was to click on delete layer mask, by deleting it, my original image is restored, right? Vice versa, if I was to take this eraser tool and interact destructively, like I mentioned, you can see that when I erase the top corner of my image here, that is erased from the original image in a way that the mask isn't. So by erasing this, what I'm doing is functionally removing it from the original image. So this is a destructive adjustment. The only way to undo a destructive adjustment is by undoing the adjustment. So if I was to go to edit undo, this differs from a mask where I can actively interact with the mask. Destructiveness when it regards to undo is something that should probably be understood. Undo can only remember a certain number of steps that you've made, right? And after that, it's going to forget it. Or alternatively, if I was to navigate away from this image, open up a different session, a different image, then my entire undo history completely forgotten, right? So when I say destructive, I just mean that, pardon me, I just mean that when I make a change with like something like the eraser tool to my base image, it's removed forever. Um, Caveat there, but for the most part, forever. Whereas using something like masking, masking is informing that base image, not taking away from it. So if I was to click on the AI action, select subject, it's going to make a selection in the same way that our AI object selection did. So if I click on this, it's going to make that selection. It looks pretty faithful to the one that the AI selection did, and it's much better than a one that I could create using the brush selection tool and a bunch of time. So I have my selection here. Now if I navigate back to the masks, right, they'll add a layer mask. My mask returns, and as such, my selection is highlighted. It's in view, and the corresponding background around my image is also now a transparency in the same way we described earlier. So we talked a little bit about why we would want to avoid maybe using something like the eraser tool. Let's now illustrate or show why a mask is quite powerful in that we can return elements to view, or we can sort of show the original image through. So I have my mask here, the little thumbnail, and I make sure that it's selected. I know it's selected because there's these little 4 kind of corners that are highlighted, which when I select on my base image, it does the same. But if I select on this little mask here, and if I click on my brush tool as an example, and I make sure that the brush color is white, when I brush, right, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be brushing on, turning on a part of my image. So what I'm seeing here is that corner comes back into view. And again, the reason why I do that, or rather why I see that, is because this mask is informing the contents of, or what we see, of the original image. So when I turn this on, or when I brush on white, this mask interprets me brushing on white as turning on, or rather showing the pixels in that part of my image. Inversely, in the same way that we understood previously, if I start to brush on black, right, it takes those pixels away, removes them, and therefore shows to me the transparency. The transparency that therefore contains no pixel information. So, what are some takeaways from what I'm doing before we move on? By selecting my subject, I've made I had that red overlay pop up, and that red overlay tells me something. It tells me that I can do various things with that selection. One of the things that we can do with it is to create a transparency in my image by masking out my subject. So all I did was select my subject and then mask my subject and essentially show it while hiding everything else from view. So let's take this a step further. Maybe there's a good time to ask any questions. I see Steve has a question, and I'm just going to write down LJ's suggestion. Line outlines. I will answer this in more depth after the workshop. Yeah, okay. This is maybe something that you're actually going to want a vector editor for rather than a bitmap editor, but I'll talk about that a little bit in more depth. Steve asked, if you have time, please explain how to use the layer adjustment tool, FX tool, to adjust text. I can never get it to work to add shadow, angle, etc. Sure, I can talk about that at the end of the workshop as well, Steve. If you can stick around, I'll try to answer that to the best of my ability. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to create a transparency, an image that contains these transparent elements that enables me to utilize this in future images, right? to take this image and apply it to different images. We're going to continue with our subject here. So we have our layer. Our layer contains our person that we have, and then it contains a basically a masked selection. So that's that mask there. If I was to save this, right? I'm going to save this file, and there's two files that I'd like to showcase that contain, or rather have the ability to contain, a transparency. Number one. So I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to save this image. And I'm going to save this image as an ACDSee file format. So ACDSee has its own proprietary file type that is editable, meaning that when I save this file as an ACDSee file, all of the layers, all of the adjustments that I've made, all the non-destructive adjustments that I've made will be preserved in that file, and therefore editable in the future. So if you're working in ACDSee and you happen to be involved in the making of composition images, this is a file format that you're going to want to get very familiar with. And by say very familiar with, I just mean you should be saving your files in it, because it is what is going to provide you the ability to maintain non-destructiveness while editing your images. Other image types are going to flatten these layers. And when I say flatten layers, I mean that if I had a variety of layer adjustments here, all of those layer adjustments would be treated as one layer adjustment, or rather they'd be treated as one layer. And then that's what's going to be presented. So ACDSee files don't do that. They preserve all of the independent layers and preserve the editing functionality of those layers. So I'm going to go navigate to File, Save As. We're going to save this as Transparency. Let's say example 1. And I'm just going to save this as an ACDSee file format. And if I click Save, it'll write it. So my file is saved. That information is still present here, but let's just showcase what I mean. So if I navigate away from my file, back to Manage mode, first and foremost, you'll see that this ACDSee file is present right here. And you can see that the way that Manage mode interprets a transparency is by producing this little black box right here. So already this is telling me some really cool information about this file. It's telling me that the width and height of the image are preserved, right? We can see that that's the shape of the original image we have right here. The difference being, let's see if I can compare them. Oh, well, we're going to need to compare them in such a way that I can see that. Here, let's do it this way instead. So this is a better way of showcasing this. So here's my original image that I had, and then here's my ACDSee file. With this black area is the same as that checkerboard that we saw earlier. It's treated as a transparency. It contains no visual information, no pixel information. There's some pretty cool things we can do with an image that contains a no background in this case. This is going to be a pretty rudimentary example, but I'm just going to, let's navigate just to a landscape file just to show what I mean. It doesn't really matter what it is. This is fine. Now that I have this transparency in my image, I can make use of this. And again, please excuse this composition because it's not going to be a good composition. I just want to showcase the functionality of it. But I have my landscape image here now. And if I was to search for the same file that I just created, that transparency example, I can place that image in my file here. And as you can see, the remainder of the background of this image is not visually present. So I've saved my image as a transparency. So I can't see the black or the pixels in this. It's all just negative space, right? Okay, that's an ACDSee file. ACDSee files are proprietary, and they're only going to be something that you can open or interact in ACDSee. So how do I save a PNG that is visible, or sorry, how do I save a transparency leading the foreshadowing right here, but how do I save a transparency that is something that others can open, others can visualize and see, etc.? Well, the answer to that would be to save a PNG file. So PNG files are encoded in such a way that presents the lack of pixel information as transparent. Let me see where that folder is. So if I navigate back to my transparency folder, which should be around here somewhere, or was somewhere, there it is, it's at the top. I'll navigate back to this example, and I'll save this as a PNG instead of an ACDSee file. So I'm going to go to File here. I'm going to save this. Now, an important note that when I save this PNG, PNGs will flatten the file. So if you had multiple things informing the content of your image, multiple adjustment layers, multiple layers involved, it's going to treat that as one. It's going to flatten the whole thing, and it's going to be a destructive change in essence. What I recommend when you're creating your PNGs, or sorry, when you're creating your transparent files, just start by saving an ACDSee file and then work off of whatever you save off of those. So this gives you the ability to save a couple files, and when you save those files, the PNG will be the flattened, much smaller file as well, which we'll show. So I have my transparency example. I'll save it as a PNG, and then it's going to tell me about color profile, which I'll continue, and it's going to save this file as well. And so when I navigate back to manage mode here, the PNG displays the transparency in this case in white, which is going to be a bit different than other file types. So you can see this here. We'll just open up this file just to illustrate what it looks like. So here's a cafe photo, and I'm just going to drop my PNG into this file. So I'll click on it and click OK. And as you can see, she is now placed into my file, and you can see that the area surrounding her, right, much like the ACDSee file that I submitted, that is also transparent. So my point being is that if you're creating transparencies, you have two ways to create them. You can create them using the ACDSee file, which is going to be a larger file because it's non-destructive, or you can flatten your image in its entirety and save it as a PNG file. The benefit of a PNG file is it's a universal file type. It'll be visible to anyone. So if you want to make like some form of logo, or you plan on sharing a transparent image, or if you have some form of intention with this, right? That's how you do that. Now, people always ask about other file types. So let's do a little pause here to talk about saving this as something that isn't those two file types. Excuse me. Let's save it as a JPEG. I'll just save it as a regular old JPEG, and let's see what happens here. Yes, Della asked if I'm late. Will this be available for replay? If so, when, please? It will be, Della. I typically upload them about a day to 2 days after the workshop, so it'll just be on our YouTube page, as always. So just check it out there. Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the question. Okay, so I have my PNG that I've saved. I have my ACDSee file. Now for contrast, I'm just going to save a JPEG, and we'll see what this does to the background. So I'll write it. Well, right off the bat, I can tell you that the JPEG, unlike the PNG, unlike the ACDSee file, is interpreting the background as white, right? So more than it's flattening it, it's also instilling a color in the space where the transparency was. So JPEG doesn't work the same way as a PNG or an ACDSee file does, in the sense that what it's doing here is it's removing, right, the transparency, and it's placing a color instead of that transparency. And that color is a color of 255, or white. 255, 255, 255, or white. So if I navigate away, let's open up our cafe image again, just for, just to showcase. And we're to place our JPEG now. Let's make sure that I have the JPEG. That's it. You'll see that the JPEG doesn't deal with the image in the same way that my PNG does. So when I go to place it, my image now has that white background around it. So, as a transparency, this isn't really something that is useful to me or helpful to me. It is a flattened file, and I will admit there is no background. So, the JPEG was able to, obviously take out that background, and it instills white in the place where there should be transparency. But it isn't really useful for me. Maybe not useful for compositions, and certainly not useful if I wanted to create a watermark or something like that. For example, if I was to go to the watermark tool, right? Watermarks typically want you to place a PNG file or a file that has just the focal point of the image is what is being presented. So if I was to search for a watermark and just make my watermark this woman, for example, this PNG file, right? Well, that works as a watermark. I guess I would probably want text or something over top of it. And Marge's photography company, but you can see that that is interpreted as a transparency, and therefore the background is versus using a JPEG or something like that that produces white in the space of that, and then therefore becomes disruptive in my overall image, whatever. This is perhaps a crude example because I wouldn't obviously use a photograph as a watermark, but you take my point, and that the PNG is able to produce a graphic that contains a transparency in this case. So let's skip. Oh, let's restore that. So there's a couple things to note here, and that we took a selection that we turned into a mask, and then using that mask, what we did is we saved a file, and that file had the background removed, or the background was interpreted as transparent. And then from there, we saved that as a ACDSee file, a PNG file, and a JPEG. And we showcase that there are differences between the way these files work. Practically, ACDSee files are non-destructive. They're also the largest of the other files, file type-wise. For example, if I draw your attention to this file right here, you can see that this file is 85 megabytes. So that's a fairly substantial file. Versus this file is the PNG file is 12 megabytes. And then the JPEG will be even smaller at 2 megabytes, right? Now, these files are still quite large. They're 5,000 pixels by 3,000 pixels. So I would say that's a large to extra large file type. But there's substantial differences in terms of the way that those images are in terms of their file size. So once again, just down at the bottom here, 85 to 12 to 2. So transparencies are something, PNGs, are something that keep that in mind, but as a result, they are a slightly larger file type than, say, something like a JPEG, right? So what you're gaining in editability and function, you're also losing in file type. So there's some considerations, file size. There's some considerations to make in that regard. So the takeaway being is that transparencies are, okay, so a practical application of transparency. Here's something. If you're in a position where you have a family photo and someone is missing from that family photo, this would be a really cool tool to use, because then you could take a really nice photo of the family member that is then missing from the family shot and put them in using that transparency tool, using that function that I mentioned earlier. So you can create a transparency of your subject matter standing there, and then you can add that or slide that into the image. And as a result, you've combined those two things together and in such a way that is, relatively speaking, pretty non-destructive. So it gives you the ability to then edit that family photo in the future or whatever. So, but the PNG would be, stable in that photo, and it'd be useful for also it wouldn't, exceed, it wouldn't overly add to the file size in that image in the same way that a fully masked image would. Does anyone else have any other questions? I feel like I've been talking for a while, and I would just want to have some opportunities to answer some questions. I will answer Steve's question if no one else has any questions that pertain to the content of the workshop today. But hopefully what you can do is you can see that transparencies are something that are easily created in ACDSee. They're useful from a standpoint of that they allow you a lot of compositional editing capacities. And then the other thing to keep in mind too, is that there's ways to create them that are non-destructive, and also just showcases a little bit of understanding about how images are interpreted from a standpoint of not only color but also about what exists on the canvas when you remove or take away elements from it. Okay, so earlier Steve asked, if you have time, please explain how to use the layer adjustment tool, the FX tool. Um, and I can never get it to work. Add the shadow angle, etc. I'll get to Gordon and Harvey's questions in a moment here. So, Steve, I'm just going to open up this one image here, and we're going to talk about the FX panel really quickly. This is cool. I rarely talk about this tool, but it is quite interesting. So, FX is a HEIC files are supported, Peter. I'm not sure how it interprets them or how the how the analysis works of the but they are something that recently within the last 2 issues of ACDSee that were something that were accounted for, and now HEIC does work. Whether or not they're editable, questions for the developers for sure, but my understanding is that I remember HEIC being on the list of things to incorporate into the software, and were added. So just a quick answer. Okay, Steve's question. So Steve's asking about this tool right here. So this tool is a tool called Layer Effects. So Layer Effects, actually, this is kind of a cool thing because we can talk a little bit more about our PNG layer. So I'm going to open up this cafe again, and we're just going to add our lady. There she is. Very service counter-esque. I'm just going to place it in the center for now. So an FX adjustment is a layer effect that is we can add to a particular layer in our image. So if I was to click on outline, right, for example, outline is being applied to the active layer, and then I can apply various adjustments to my outline. Note that because my image is a transparency, and the outline is only applied to the part of the image that contains pixel information. So indirectly, Steve asked a really great question about how we can incorporate using the FX tools really matters when it comes to something like a PNG file. So this would just be that image, and then I have my transparency here, and I can move my subject around, and henceforth, so also does the FX. So, couple things to note about FX. First and foremost, when you click on the tool itself, right, it's going to open up the layer effects box. The second thing is you have to actually check one of these functions. So navigating to outline is not enough to apply an outline. You also have to click this little box here, and then by clicking the box, the application will be applied. Same for, I don't know, let's go shadow. So I've added a shadow as well as an outline. Crazy, but I've done it. So once that box is clicked, the effect is active, and then I have the settings. The settings I can find by navigating to the corresponding word. So shadow settings are under shadow, outline settings are under outline. And then it gives me the ability to add opacity, blur, thickness in outline versus blur, distance, and opacity and color in shadow. Now, when I've navigated away, from my image here, and I want to get back to the FX panel, you can simply click on the FX tab right here, and it'll reopen with the corresponding tools that you've adjusted. So let's talk about text. So Steve said, I cannot get shadow to work with text. Let's give it a go. I'm going to add some text to this image. I'll just add the word cafe. Okay. So, and then I'll place this in the center here, and I'll commit the file. So the file is placed. You can see my text here, and now I can go in and I can add FX to this layer. And so the FX panel pops up, and you are wanting to work with shadow. So shadow pops up. So I'll click on the shadow icon right here, click on that button right there. And then it gives me the ability to move that shadow further away. or increase or lower the opacity or change the color of the shadow, right? Oh, heinous. Heinous color to apply there. And then the blur increases or decreases correspondingly to my yeah. So I'm not clicking just on the so there's think of it in this way, Steve. If I want to apply a bevel to this image, okay, the image being the text box, I would navigate to the bevel tool itself, and then I would apply it. So I simply clicking on the bevel is not enough. I also need to click on this text box here, and that is what will apply to the bevel. Clicking on the word bevel pops up with the tools that correspond to it. So that's what gives me the ability to add a groovy bevel to the word cafe in this image. If I close this, I can reopen it by clicking on the layer effect. So pretty cool. Great question. And actually quite relevant to this PNG that we've created. Okay, let's go back. So Gordon asked, when you add the transparent image to the original JPEG, oh, I see. Do you save it later as a new JPEG? Okay. So this is a question about destructiveness and destructibility. I'll navigate away. Let's just restart. I'll open up this cafe image again because this refers to what you're talking about. So Gordon's when you add the transparent image, so let's add the transparent image. So I'll add our transparency here, our PNG file, and she pops up in the center here with the cafe in the background. Do you save it later as a new JPEG? So Gordon's question is the question I would ask you, Gordon, in this case is, do you want to edit this file in the future? Are you happy with what you've created? If you're happy with what you've created, then it matters not if you save it as a JPEG, a PNG, a TIFF file, whatever. If you intend to have some degree of non-destructiveness in your file and you intend to edit it in the future, save it as an ACDSee file. There really is, the ACDSee file is the only file format in this list, and it will pop up by default, that gives you the ability to edit layers in the future. It preserves the layer order. If I was to save this as a JPEG or a TIFF or PNG or something, it will flatten this layer on top of this layer, and it will treat it as one unit, and it will remove the editing history from the file. So you will not be able to undo anything. If you save it as an ACDSee file format, however, so I'm going to do that, I don't know, test file. If I save it in here, right? When I save an ACDSee file, even if I've navigated away from the file, I've closed the software or whatever, if I open it up again in edit mode and it's saved as an ACDSee file, those two layers will still be present, as you're about to see, transparency above the AI actions, and therefore can be edited in the future. So if I wanted to, make her smaller or whatever, I could do that, and then I could save the file correspondingly. So are you happy with your image? If you are, doesn't matter how you save it. If you want to preserve editability, ACDSee file. Does that make sense, Gordon? Let me know. I want to share with others. If you want to share with others, you're probably going to want a very small file type, right? So JPEG, if a file you share with others is not going to be a file that anyone else is going to edit. So having editability doesn't matter in this case. File size matters. Your friend James that you sent this image to is not going to open up an ACDSee and make adjustments to the image. He's just going to be looking at it, right? So JPEG, just send them a small file size. It only matters if you're trying to edit the image in the future. Now, something to keep in mind too is it's not one or the other. You can save an ACDSee file, an editable file, and then save that ACDSee file as a JPEG and just send your client the JPEG, right? You can have both. You can save as many files as you want. So I would just make sure to save the ACDSee file format first so you don't lose the editability. Okay. Groovy was the correct adjective for the bevel. Awesome. Okay, Harvey asked, is there a technique for masking hair? It's hard to get perfect. Great question. Yeah. Yeah, it does. Okay, so first of all, the answer to this question is yes. It might take a bit more time than we have, but there's a couple of ways to answer this question. So obviously we're seeing still a bit of green come through in a hair. That's what your concern is. So AI automation, an AI selection is what we started with here, right? That's going to create a selection that we might need to adjust in the future, right? And an AI selection isn't going to be perfect. So when we go to make a mask of this case, the fringes of her hair will still need to be adjusted. So manually, what you would want to consider, right, is to use something like the brush tool. And then you would want to use something like smart brushing to clean this up. And so what this might look like is you getting in really nitty gritty. Oops. Dramatically lowering the tolerance. Oh, that's still not what we want. Oh, I know why. There we go. Yeah, there we go. And going through and, removing, or rather making a selection of the green you don't like because you intend to remove it. AI selections are automated and therefore they're not perfect. So this is something that you'd have to do by hand, basically. The other way is you can always refine selections. So if I was to, just to be clear, if I was to do something like this, okay, I've made sort of like a brush selection. I would then navigate to my mask, and then I would do something like I would erase that area. Oops. And it probably will require further cleanup. Yeah, definitely a little bit further cleanup. But if I was to do that, it would look something like this. Oops. And it's going to leave a little bit of bits in the hair that we'll need to fix. But there's less green in that hair fringes than there were previously, as an example. Number two would be, let's see if I can find an image that has finer hair, because this one isn't that fine. Let's see. I'm going to go to my people folder here. Where are you? There you are. Let's find someone with frizzy hair or something like this. Might be a good example. Let's try this. The other thing we can do, yeah, this would probably work. So I'll select my subject again. Okay, if I find that too much haloing is occurring, so what haloing is it's when the color of my hair is shining through too much on the edges because of the light of the background. What I could always do is I could make a selection. So I'll go to make a selection of my subject again. And then while the pending selection is active here, what I would do is I would navigate to select and refine. And then what I would want to refine is a refine with a negative shifted edge. So by reducing the shift edge like to negative 13 or something like that here, it's going to adjust the selection in such a way that is going to make it so that those red areas are removed. I want to be very clear that this is not a perfect process. Automated selections are not equivalent to manual selections. This obviously has its own limitations and things that we'll still need to address here. So I guess the short answer to your question is that there are some ways for you to go in manually and adjust those, and I think they would be the best method. In certain situations, this was maybe not a great example, but in certain situations, refining the edge of really detailed selections will enable you to pull that selection inwards and remove haloing and things like that. But yeah, you're going to want to go in with your brush tool and be very precise in what you're removing and what you're adding. I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but cleaning up hair in this case is going to require accurate selections. So the other thing you could do is you could select your subject and you say, hey, this looks really good. This selection looks really good up to her hair up here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this part of my selection and I'm going to do the rest manually. So I have my active selection that I made with select subject. I navigated over to the brush selection tool. And then from here, I'm going to open up the magic tool. This is what's going to enable me to make selections of my hair without capturing this area. So it'll just select these pixels. And then what I would do is I would go in and be really selective, really slow about, um, which part of the hair I'm selecting or whatever. So this is a way to get around, poor performing automated selections. Okay. Dan asked, can you add a selection to an existing mask? Yeah. Yeah, you can. Let's talk about it. So let's mask our image here. So here is our mask. Let's see how it looks. It's okay. I still incomplete hair, but so you want to work with an additional selection and then add it to this. Thanks, Peter. Have a great day. Okay, let me think about this. So the first thing you could do is you can right click your mask, Dan, and you can add mask to selection. So what that does is it takes the mask that already exists and it makes it back into a selection. The mask doesn't disappear, but the selection does appear. So you can also looks like there's some options here. So you can subtract mask from selection, which would mean that you'd be selecting everything that this isn't. You can intersect the mask with selection, so focus on the elements where those two things connect. And you can also send it to the selection basket. But for the purpose of your question, maybe adding your mask to your selection would be a way to work with a selection, or rather pull up a selection on an active mask. The other thing to keep in mind is that once the mask is created, the selection is already created. So when I click on the mask itself, if I wanted to add elements back, basically I don't, oops, what happened to that? There, I moved it accidentally. I can just use the brush tool, right? To bring back elements of my selection that's like akin to adding those, or it's akin to adding them, or engaging with the selection tool. So when I'm interacting with my mask, keep in mind all this mask is telling me is that black is turning that part of my mask off, which means it's hidden from view, and white is turning that part of my image on, which means it's presenting it. So in a way, this works very similar to you just making a selection, especially if you're making something like a manual selection. So there's a couple different ways for you to get the goal that you're getting at. Marv asked, there is a selection tool that chooses the same color. Can you show that selection tool? Yeah. So if I go to select and I go to luminance and color range, or channel selection, these tools will enable you to make selections predicated on certain spectrums of color. So, for example, let's make sure I'm actually interacting with my base image here. If I go to channel selection, here's my image. And if I was to channel on blue, for example, it would be channeling parts of my images that contain blue. Now, notably, every pixel will contain some degree of blue. So just be mindful that the areas of your image that are going to be more blue will be more selected than parts of your image that aren't. Vice versa, CMYK. CMYK is a print breakdown. Predicated on cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Then there's lab coloring, and then HSL, which is hue, saturation, and lightness. So this would be really broad spectrums of color. Additionally, you can go to luminance and color range and select based on a hard particular color. So if I scroll outwards, the part of my image that is predominantly blue would be this jacket here, right? So I could select based on that color using the luminance and color range function, and then I can then mask accordingly. So if I have a blue ball in my image or something like that, I could search for blue. The luminance and color range tool will select the blue ball, and then I can work with that how I want. The main thing to note is that color range, there might be several parts of your image that are blue. And a good example of this in my image is the eyes are blue. So I'm seeing a little red overlay appear in the eyes. So what I might want to do is use the luminance and color range tool to start my selection process in the same way that I did with the AI selection. and then just remove the parts of my image I actually don't want to adjust. Oopsies. Definitely didn't want to do that. I want to deselect. There we go. So I would be moving those there. So adding elements that I want and then removing them in correspondence with what I'm actually seeing. So if I wanted to select these little parts of the fringes of her lapel and such, I'd want to go in and brush those on. Keep in mind that I'm using the brush selection tool to add to the color selection that I've created and started with. That's Marv's suggestion, is combining multiple selection methods with both manual as well as automated processes. With the automated processes he was referring to are ones that select basically by brightness or by color, in this case hue. Great question. That covers it for today, folks. Does anyone else have any other questions before I sign off? Like I said, this will be uploaded to our YouTube page. I'm going to just edit it once we're done our workshop here. But great questions, as always. And so I have some suggestions here. Let me just make sure I'm ready. Oh, that's right. Sorry. I had one question from LJ. LJ asked, I do laser cuttings of wood items. Individuals send me items or photos, and I need to outline for the laser process. I have used a camera and ACDSee, but get ragged edges from pixels. Need better separation. Laser cutting. So this is a very complicated question, and doesn't have a strict, easy answer. But basically, I think using ACDSee. So ACDSee is a bitmap software or a raster software. Rasters are they are not scalable, nor are they. They're essentially, this would be looking into the difference between a vector and a raster. Vectors are like a geometric shape predicated on a pattern or some form of object, and then because of the geometric relationship of it, they can be scaled to any size and are very determinate lines. Whereas raster images are a pattern of I guess what we're describing here, right, is this meshing of pixels. And so rasters are more they're not as acute in terms of the separation between those pixels. If I was doing laser cuttings, I would be using a vector software, not a raster software, to create my images. And the reason why is because what I would be doing is I would be taking a base image, LJ. For example, let's say my image is of a whale, like an orca or something like that. And my client says, I really like this photograph of this orca I took. I want to turn this into a laser cut. What I would do as the artist in this case is I would make a vector outline of the orca, and then I would use that in my laser cutting software, however the actual process works. What I wouldn't use is a raster, and the raster will be more jagged and less precise and non-streamline in the way that it wouldn't be like a straight, easy, articulated line. It would be kind of obtuse, and there'll be granular problems with the line because it's using an image that is basically a series of squares rather than a straight line. So LJ, the answer to your question, and is someone who's had many years of graphic design history, is I would look into on either YouTube or on Google or something like that. I would look at the difference between a vector software and a raster software, really metabolize what the differences are, and then explore maybe looking into purchasing a vector software. ACDSee has never claimed to be and isn't a vector software. And vector softwares are very specific in their function, and they are, they're something that it's not something that ACDSee's ever claimed to be, and it doesn't do exactly what you're asking. You can make outlines in ACDC, and you can you can try to get something like that that'll work for your laser cutting process, but they're never going to be perfect. And so what you're describing is pixel perfect, and for something to be pixel perfect, you'll probably have to explore a vector software. Um, yeah, I'm not sure if did that answer your question, LJ? That's a again like a very good question, and it's not one that I have a simple answer to you because essentially, in essence, what I'm telling you is that you need a different software for what you're trying to do. Um, yeah, which is maybe not the news you want to hear, but there's a real difference between raster softwares and vector softwares. To give you an idea, the last thing I'll say on this is that for many years, I worked at a print shop. Okay, so I was designing materials that were intended to go to print. Um, I would use Photoshop and ACDSee and other softwares for raster images, which would often contain photographs. Now, when I had to create a signage for something that was being put on the side of a car, or I needed to create a logo for a business card, or I needed to create a what they call a media wall, things that needed to be scaled. Raster images are always determined sizes, right? So what I needed is I needed a file that I could scale upwards with the size of the thing that I needed, the ultimate end product. So using a photograph to put on the side of a car, right? Unless I have an enormous file type, that's going to be a really, really hard for me. It's going to do something called pixelation. It's going to pixelate the image, meaning that I'm taking an image and expanding the pixels far past what they're capable of. And so I get an image that's blurry. Vector softwares will provide me the ability to create an outline of things that's always going to be uniform in its appearance, regardless of how big it is. And so what you're describing is needing a tool that will create something similar, create a vector line that will engage with that you can use to then create a woodcut with. I'm from BC, Harvey. um, light burn. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. So, just out of curiosity, have you been using ACDC to try to make these woodcut files? I just want to understand, or have you been using these other softwares for that? Because yeah, from just a standpoint of making these, this is just of interest to me. I've seen woodcuts; they're very precise. Oh yeah, nice for the TC. Yeah, for what Harvey's just describing is the we're just it's the newspaper in the city I'm from. So the main newspaper. Um, anyway, all being said, yeah, I mean, ACDC's actual home office is in Victoria, so most of the people that work for ACDC work in either Victoria or they work in. I think there's a couple offices in Vancouver, and then there might be some. Actually, there's. I think we have an office in China as well that works with our Chinese clients and such. Okay, I'm gonna sign off for today. If LJ understands what I'm describing, yeah, awesome. I would explore probably trying to use a vector software for what you're describing, and or just look up YouTube difference between vector and raster softwares, and you'll get an answer. Okay, I'm going to sign off. That's an hour and 8 minutes. I will upload this soon. Thank you so much for participating. And if you have any suggestions for workshops, just send me them to me over Connect, and I'll add them to our listing for looks like May. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.